Uh, Good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. My name is Steve Levine. I am a partner and leader of Husch Blackwell's national cannabis practice. Thank you all for joining. Before we begin, I'd just like to cover a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your audience console, there are multiple application icons for use during the program today. If you have any questions during our webcast, please submit them via the question box. I'll be actively monitoring them, and I'll really try to answer as many questions as we can. So please put those in there as we're going through things if you have topics that you'd like to discuss. To the extent we're unable to answer any of those questions, we'll do our best to follow up via email. A PDF of the presentation will be available in your resource folder. The program has been approved for CLE hours. To report your hours on the CEU icon at the bottom of the screen. A certificate of attendance, including course numbers, will be emailed to you tomorrow, along with a recording of the webcast for watching and sharing. Toward the end of the program, please complete a survey. Your input is valuable to us, and would like to know how we can further improve upon these programs as they could be applicable to your business. So that's all with the housekeeping items. We'll go ahead and get started with the program. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. Really, we're here to once again talk about how the MED has modified and updated rules. As probably most of you know that are on this webinar today, this is sort of our annual response and review of what happens here in Colorado, the constant changing laws, and really today we're going to go through a high-level review of some of them, not all of them. There's really way too many to try to accomplish in a 1-hour webinar, but really look forward to going through some high-level things that hopefully you find of value. Just right before we get into that, I do want to make a quick little plug for both something that Alyssa and I are working on. Our firm has established what we're referring to as HB Communities for Change. This is really our social equity initiative, where we've hired a gentleman named Quincy McNeil as our pro bono counsel who is implementing HB Communities for Change. This is really to help nonprofits of minority-owned businesses that are either nonprofits on a pro bono basis in cities where we have offices. I'm sure many of you know there's been some social equity initiatives being put forward in Denver, in particular with delivery. So we are going to try to help out some minority-owned businesses that might be interested in obtaining a social equity application and working through that process. So something that we're both passionate about and really think is a critical component to the cannabis industry that we're all really a part of. So with that, I'd like to introduce Alyssa Samuel. Alyssa has been with Husch Blackwell for a handful of years now. She's been in the cannabis game for upwards of 10 years, both as a in-house counsel, but also out external counsel as well. She really helps on both M&A, corporate, and various regulatory matters for clients, not here just in Colorado, but nationally as well. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Alyssa and look forward to our presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve, and thank you everyone for joining us today. We selected to go over really just the science and policy aspects of the rules. There were some new rule changes related to the accelerator program as well, which relates to our HB Communities for Change social equity initiative that Steve just talked about. But today we're focusing just on the science and policy rules. And so there have been 3 sort of sets of recent changes. There was an emergency rule in December related to heavy metals testing, and we'll go over that at the end. There were changes effective January 1st that we'll start with, and then we'll move to the newest changes that will go into effect on May 1st. So the main areas that were impacted by the rule changes that went into effect on January 1st were sustainability and waste processing and consumer waste, the additive definition changes and the addition of botanically derived compounds, vaporizer delivery device labeling and expiration dates, and some changes to sampling and testing requirements. So sustainability. The Colorado MED has partnered with the Colorado Department of Health and Public Health and the Environment, and they issued a survey and tried to implement some changes that would help the industry in efforts to be more sustainable and also reduce some of the costs for the industry. So with respect to waste disposal, that was one area they started at, and they looked at other states. They looked at California, they looked at Maine, they looked at Massachusetts, and they looked at how those states were requiring their licensees to dispose of cannabis waste. Some of them still were using the 50-50 mix of, requiring it to be mixed with other wastes and being unusable and unrecognizable, et cetera. And some of them are allowing or requiring composting, and some of them aren't requiring the 50-50. So Colorado, after a lot of thought and some specific work groups, changed Rule 3, Series 3230 regarding waste disposal to allow for the 50-50 mix to include manure, which helps for uses of what the waste can be used for, and also permitted some additional types of sustainable methods, which are exempt from that 50-50 requirement, such as on-site composting, anaerobic digestion, pyrolysis into biochar, and biomass gasification. The rules then also allow licensees to use other parts of their licensed premises or premises that they have control of that maybe aren't part of the licensed premises to operate some of these functions, or transfer to an unlicensed operator. But the benefits of a lot of these types of waste disposal are that they're sustainable and they can be used in practice for cultivations. So, composting, everyone sort of knows what composting is. Anaerobic digestion is putting the waste into an oxygen-deprived chamber, and that creates biofuel or biomass that can be used as fertilizer and nutrient enhancements for soil. Pyrolysis into biochar burns it into a type of charcoal that's also a nutrient enhancement, and biomass gasification works similarly to those processes. So these can be performed on site as part of the licensed premises, or on a part of the licensed premises that is on a part of the premises that's not licensed, as long as the licensee still has control of it, or it can go to an unlicensed third party. And then there are all sorts of requirements under this rule for how that can be accomplished. You need to have an agreement with an unlicensed party that contains certain requirements. It still needs to be put in metric under waste management. Only certain types of plants can go, like flower is not a part of this exception, but stalk, stem, fan leaves, etc. Those are all subject to this change in the rule. With respect to consumer waste, there were changes to Rule Series 340 regarding the collection of consumer waste. So medical marijuana stores and retail marijuana stores can accept containers from customers, and they could under the old rules too, and there are certain requirements for how they have to be collected and stored, but now the rules allow for them to be sanitized and then reused. So some of the feedback in these work groups was how much packaging and labeling waste there is in the cannabis industry based on the requirements for child-proof containers. And then every time there is a change in the rules, there's a lot of waste packaging and labeling. And so this is an effort to combat that and allow the industry to collect some of that expensive packaging and then sanitize and reuse it.
And I would add there too, clearly sustainability is, I think, something we all hopefully are striving for to protect our environment with climate change and all those things. But I also think this is a good business opportunity to demonstrate to both your patients and your customers that you are taking steps to be sustainable. I think these are all great things that you can promote and share with your customers and patients, and I think will go a long way to not just being good for the environment, but also hopefully good from a business perspective as well.
Yes, Steve. Not only is this appealing to socially conscious and environmentally conscious customers, it also can be cost saving on the operational side too. You're doing something good for the environment, but also reusing your own materials in a cost effective way. For outdoor grows, if you have extra land or extra space, this is something that you can also use that for. There are also a number of other opportunities in Colorado. The Colorado Department of Public Health and the Environment is very aware that the cannabis industry has been held to an elevated standard in a lot of ways and is trying to loosen some restrictions to allow it to be easier for the industry to be more sustainable. So in October, they had a town hall and discussed the Colorado Office of Energy's program that allows cultivations to work with the office to do a free of charge energy assessment to help cultivators figure out how to best maximize their energy and make them eligible for different rebates and different programs. And so we're happy to talk to anyone about those programs as well if there is interest.
Great.
So additives. The Colorado Science and Policy Work Group has an entire subcommittee related to additives. And an additive is anything that is, obviously any ingredient that is added to product. Oh, where did this slide go?
So I'm seeing the additive slide, if that's what you're looking at, Alyssa. Are you wanting to fast forward
My
it?
slide just disappeared.
Okay. Do you want me to move on to the next one, showing the rule?
That's okay. I can talk about it. I just can't see it. So, all right. So additives are one of the changes to the additive definition is that they added botanically derived compound to this definition. So before, the definition did not necessarily include things like terpenes or anything that is extracted and then modified and then added back into the product. That is no longer the case, and that means that any of those compounds now must be listed on ingredients lists and are subject to some of the same subject to the same rules that other additives are. So this is going to have impacts on a lot of different compounds that are typically used or added and changed and moved back in. It also impacts give me just a second.
And I can advance the slides if you just want to let me know.
Yes. So if you switch to the slide entitled Additives, Rule 335, and I pulled it up on another screen so I know where I am. Okay. So Rule 335H is not new. It was just relocated, and this could potentially have some impacts on the discussion of Delta 8, particularly hemp-derived Delta 8 that's brought into the system and processed, or any other hemp-derived compounds. And the reason for that is this rule prohibits anything that can be toxic or misleading to patients or consumers. And with there is some concern that hemp-derived compounds that are brought in that are not tested and treated in the same way that we do under the regulated marijuana system could potentially have toxic effects if they have not been tested, and could potentially be misleading to patients or consumers. So for something particularly like Delta 8, we all know it's not as potent as Delta 9, but there is some potency. There is some potency there. And so using that as an additive to anything, it could be potentially misleading to consumers based on how potent that product might be. And we also don't know a lot about byproducts for some of the compounds that are being played with right now. So that's something to just be aware of, that this rule is out there, and that anything that is being added, whether or not it's botanically derived, even from the same plant, is still held to the same standard under the rules.
So I'll just ask a question. So I'm a licensed producer. How do I know what's toxic, and how do I know what makes something that's more addictive? Are those defined terms?
And so they're not defined terms, and that's what makes this rule a little bit harder to follow. What that means is that as an operator, if you're continuing to produce something that maybe you're unaware of is toxic, but later is found to have toxic effects, that could have some significant regulatory or product liability ramifications for you.
Yeah, and I've been talking about this for a while. The product liability wave of litigation is coming, and if you think otherwise, I think you're really putting your head in the sand, frankly, with the amount of states that we have online now, the amount of sort of last-ditch effort from aggressive non-marijuana supporters. We are going to see a huge uptick, in particular in product liability, and rules like this that are very broad, that talks about generally toxic and generally something that is more addictive. These are very broad terms and words that the MED wants to use so that they can regulate this industry, but it will be used in a manner that is not favorable to operators because of these sort of product liability cases that I think, frankly, are just around the corner.
And with that, that's a perfect segue into vaporizer delivery devices, which are, as we saw with a lot of the vitamin E acetate issues and a lot of the concerns around MCT, vaporizer delivery probably is one of the areas of this industry that probably has the most risk of product liability, because we're dealing with concentrates that have a number of additives and a number of other variables like hardware that you're not sure what the impacts could be, how that's going to interact with the different compounds that you're using. And then you have this concept of emissions, and we'll get to that a little bit later. So vaporizer delivery devices are anything that is inhalable regulated marijuana concentrate, which may be comprised of other ingredients inside of a device that uses a heating element to create a vapor, including but not limited to vaporizer cartridges and vaporizer pens. So going into effect will be rules that these devices need to have an expiration date as determined by Rule 335, which considers potency and contaminant testing, expiration dates of any additives that are added, interaction of the concentrate of those additives with the hardware, final formulation within the device, ideal storage conditions for the device and the containing that compound. And the licensees may use accelerating stability tests. They don't need to. And how the licensee determines these dates must be data driven, and the data used to determine that needs to be documented and maintained. So it can't just be an arbitrary date that you choose and you think works. You actually need to maintain records of how you arrived at that determination. You do have some time, though. These rules will not go into effect until July 1st of 2022. So there's some time to develop the science around that, do some testing, figure out what works best for your business, and optimize products. Along with those rules, there will be a labeling requirement that will go into effect earlier that includes all ingredients, including additives. And the expiration date will need to be on there, as well as the storage conditions. One of the biggest things is the emissions testing. So Rule 41110K, which will go into effect January 1st of 2022. The other two rules were July. This rule, Colorado is one of the first states to come up with this mandate for licensees. And this is important because really what the consumer is consuming is post pyrolysis, and it is post heating up that concentrate within the hardware and then inhaling it. And that inherently changes what the consumer will be consuming. And so we as a state have decided that this is something that needs to be tested. Other states are looking at it, but this is the first implemented rule. So as of January 1st, 2022, there will need to be emissions testing conducted on any of these vaporizer delivery devices.
And clearly, as most everybody, unless you're in the testing world, are probably not very happy about this one, right? I mean, there's already challenges on concerns about accuracy of testing, concerns about really the methodology that some labs use. And so now we're talking about a brand new type of test. What's the methodology going to look like? What is the standardization going to be between labs? I mean, these are all things that are going to sort of shake out over the next year or so. But these are all concerns that, to the extent you are in the concentrate business, you need to be aware of them. Need to understand, wow, this might impact your business. What are you adding? What are you doing? These are all things that are going to continue to be highly regulated. And again, to go back to my products liability piece, from what I've heard through the industry, there's definitely certain types of vaporizing devices that if concentrate is left in those devices for too long, that concentrate might actually break down some of the internal mechanisms of those devices, which then leaches heavy metals and other things into the oil. And so that's where a lot of the shelf life rules, I think, are coming from. But again, this speaks to what is that liability potential, understanding what the product is that you're putting out there. And so if you're on the manufacturing side, making sure that you have your R&D down, understand exactly what you're putting out into the marketplace. And then on the retail side, you still have some responsibilities. So if you're selling devices and products in your store that you don't make, but that ultimately might hurt somebody, depending upon what your vendor contracts and supply contracts look like with those particular suppliers of those devices and or concentrate, you could face liability for things that all you did was just sell off your shelf. And so, I really encourage everyone to rethink their existing vendor contracts, supply contracts. I know a lot of people out there in the industry do a lot of things on handshakes, and I get it. And, I think that's how things were done for quite some time. But we're a $2 billion plus sale business a year. And you need to look back at what your contracts say, make sure liability is properly being allocated. And to the extent you need any of your Husch Blackwell attorneys to help you on that issue, we're happy to do so. But these are all things that are really coming down the pipe. And I think the individuals that are not prepared and don't understand how you could better protect yourself are going to see some real harm.
Moving on to sampling. The main changes with respect to sampling are that there now needs to be a designated area where you collect samples that is under video surveillance. The sample increments have much better definition, and the number of samples are outlined very specifically. There needs to be designated sample collectors, and there needs to be 2 of them present when samples are taken. So there also needs to be a sample plan. So the rule 41110, A4 discusses timing, how often these needs to be done. The requirements to become a designated test batch collector. So it's not as simple as just appointing someone in metric as a manager or test batch collector. There's actually training that needs to occur to make sure that you have enough staff that is qualified to do this. And then 2 of them need to be present whenever samples are taken, and it needs to be pursuant to a sample plan. And all of these things need to be in standard operating procedures. So the rule also contains the slide that I have right here is a part of the rule, and it very clearly outlines your sample increments and number of samples. And Steve, while we're on liability, I think this would be a good time to talk about the importance of specific SOPs and the importance of following them.
Sure. So, we help a lot of clients with med investigations related to sampling and testing. I think a big focus from the regulator's perspective with respect to sampling and testing, really is generated from either going to a lab and visually inspecting samples, which they do on a regular basis, if you weren't aware of that, and or asking labs to actually provide product that they think might be tainted. And so they are really concerned about product being modified, inconsistent with SOPs. And so what we have found is for certain clients, really where we see some issues pop up is non-conformity with SOPs. And so a product comes up hot or has too much microbials or whatever that issue is, the med comes in and wants to talk to the sampling persons and get an understanding of what the process is. And so they'll interview, they'll take notes, and they'll go through the whole process, and then they'll ask for the SOPs, and they'll try to match up what they've just heard from your employees, and see what is being followed and what's not being followed. And if your employees are describing a process that is completely inconsistent with your SOPs, you can pretty much guarantee you're going to have some type of investigation. And so it's really critical to, one, make sure your SOPs are up to date. We obviously have new rules, so you're going to need to look at those and come up and make sure that your rules are in conformity with, your SOPs are in conformity with those updated rules. And then make sure the individuals that are operating under those respective SOPs understand them, understand the process, are not deviating from that process. These are all factors that will really go towards alleviating concerns from a regulatory perspective that you are somehow adulterating or modifying product prior to it being testing because you're not consistent with your SOPs. And so I think it's critical to review those, critical to continue on with training on a regular basis for those that are preparing samples and testing, and really truly understanding these rules because they're not clear, they're complex, they're really confusing. CDPHE guidance on sampling procedures is frankly not consistent with what the rules actually say. And so there's just a lot of confusion, both on the licensee side, both at the med. And unfortunately, if there's confusion, the med thinks you did something wrong, the likelihood of you just walking away from it is not strong, and you're likely looking at some sort of settlement or a hearing, which nobody really wants to go to because it might jeopardize your license. So really would encourage the focus for those on the compliance side within your organizations to constantly be reviewing and updating those SOPs and making sure your people are trained correctly.
And with that, on to testing. And as effective July 1st, we are going to have a new area that is going to be tested, and that is water activity. And the importance of SOPs will definitely come into play here. So water activity testing is going to put licensees in a spot where there needs to be a very narrow window of moisture content and water activity in regulated marijuana. So if it's too dry, obviously we know why that's a problem. If it has too much water activity, the risk is that even if it's safe, once it is transported or stored, that it will continue to grow bacteria. So water activity is not just moisture content. It's different than moisture content. Water activity is the actual energy of the water within a space. So it is the difference between if you have a bowl of water, it has very high water activity. It can flow very easily. If you put that water in a sponge, the water is restricted. It cannot move. And so the water activity in the sponge is much lower. So food testing uses water activity all the time, and water activity is the reason why you can get a cracker with cheese on it that doesn't get soggy. You may have different moisture contents in different parts of food, but things like salt or other compounds can decrease water activity without necessarily decreasing moisture. So this is an area where I think there will be some innovation on the part of our industry that is always trying to problem solve and make things better. And I'm sure that there's going to be some processes for how to best produce and meet these standards going forward, really specifically related to moisture and water activity. The other changes in here are adding pesticide testing to remediated marijuana. And so rules, and just to let everyone know, these were really small because we wanted to show the changes in the rule, but we will be sending out an email that has a link to the slides. So rule changes effective May 1st, 2021. Building on the rules that went into effect in January, the MED decided to release rules that clarified a lot of the new requirements. So related to decontamination and remediation, they added some rule clarifications and added some definitions on the difference between the two of these things. They removed water activity testing from requirements from wet hole plants. So for obvious reasons, there were operational difficulties if you were to have to test wet hole plants for water activity. And then they added this idea of facility centralization for purposes of transferring product. So remediation and decontamination now are defined terms within the rules. So remediation was previously defined, but they changed that definition and they created a definition for decontamination. So the main difference between decontamination and remediation is whether or not the product type will be impacted by it. So decontamination would be a process that a lot of folks are already using, like ozone machines, X-ray machines, those types of things that alleviate contamination, but the product type essentially stays the same. If you had flour before, you'd still have flour after. Remediation is when you might send something to extraction because it tested positive for contaminants or something along those lines, and that actually changes the product type. So, decontamination testing rule. It's rule series 4, 135. So failed contaminant testing. So if you have product that fails microbial contaminant testing, then that can, the biggest change here is that before, if you decontaminated it and retested it and it still tested hot, then you had to destroy it. So now you can decontaminate it and retest it basically until it passes. So if you're decontaminating something using ozone or one of these other methods that doesn't change the product type, you can continue to do that, and it's still subject to testing afterwards, but you don't have to destroy it if it then does not pass. One thing they added here that if the test batch fails mycotoxin or water activity testing, then the business must follow the failed contaminant testing procedures. And this also makes it clear that wet hole plant is exempt. And then I included some of the red lines so we could see without necessarily going into detail how necessarily there are a lot of requirements for how this needs to be done. And though we can do these things now, as always, there's always procedures. This is an area that also requires very, very detailed standard operating procedures. So the Met is going to look and see, what are you doing? What are your processes for decontamination? Are you following them, et cetera?
Yeah, and I'll pile on to the decontamination piece. That technology has sort of morphed over the past couple of years from these ozone machines to X-ray. And so I know a lot of our clients and other people that I know in the industry are using a variety of different techniques, changing those techniques regularly. So to the extent you're modifying it, you need to make sure your SOPs are catching up with what you're doing, because again, having those old SOPs that aren't matching what you're actually doing is going to be problematic.
And it's important for you to have SOPs on what happens with product that fails. So not just regular product, but what happens when it fails. Are we continuing to try decontamination? And then if that doesn't work and we send it to remediation, then remediation also still requires you to retest for microbial, mycotoxin, and all the other contaminants. So centralization. Centralization allows you to transfer product prior to testing under two different circumstances. So a medical or retail marijuana cultivation facility can transfer to another facility for purposes of decontamination only. So for instance, if another industry member that has a licensed cultivation has a machine or technology that can help with decontamination, you can, under contract, transfer to that facility just for that purpose. But again, this requires you to have very, very clear standard operating procedures, because the rule requires that all of your procedures have been completed before that happens. So you can't send it to another facility and then have product be treated under their standard operating procedures. It can only be sent for decontamination, and all of your other procedures need to have been followed prior to that. The other scenario where you can transfer prior to testing is if you, as a licensed operator, have multiple cultivation facilities and one of them is designated as a centralized processing hub in Metric. So Metric will allow you to designate one of your facilities, not all of them, so you can't send to all of the different ones. It just has to be one as your centralized processing hub. And you, as long as that facility has 100% of identical ownership, so there can't be different ownership for that centralized processing hub. Once it is sent there, then that hub is responsible for testing. There still needs to be separate process validation for each. So each facility will still need to have their same SOPs, same processing, etc. One change that they did make that should make it easier for operators is, prior to the change in this rule, if product was transferred for purposes of decontamination, it needed to be entered into Metric that same business day. If it is being transferred to a centralized hub, then operators will have 24 hours to enter this into inventory tracking. And again, I just have a note on, we are behind on slides. Sorry, Steve. So just so everyone can catch up, I had some illustrations of the actual rules themselves for decontamination. For centralization, this is the layout of the rule, and then I just had a note to again go over the importance of accurate SOPs in these areas when you're transferring things prior to testing or anything that is subject to testing. The importance of having accurate SOPs cannot be underscored enough. Okay, so heavy metals.
Sorry, listen, just real quick. So, and again, everyone, to the extent you have questions about a lot of the stuff that we're running through, feel free to pop them in that Q&A section. We haven't really seen anything pop in yet. Actually, I might have just gotten one, but we'll answer those after Alyssa gets through the heavy metals piece.
Okay. Heavy metals. So, as a lot of you may know, there have been a lot of problems for outdoor cultivators as a result of the fire. So there's been a lot of heavy metal contamination just from that alone. In response to that, the MET came up with an emergency rule that was effective in December. And it acknowledged the challenge of the heavy metal contamination. So heavy metal contamination was treated differently under the rules in microbial contamination. So there's things that you can do when your product tests hot for microbial contamination, but heavy metals does not have those same exceptions. And the reason for that is that if you remediate something with heavy metals in it, it could become further concentrated, and the fear is that there's a public health issue with that. So the heavy metals remediation project proposes to allow for some experimentation. So product that tests hot for heavy metals may be sent to a processor for remediation, and this is basically experimental only. So the data needs to be kept. There needs to be a proposal submitted to the MET. Then it needs to be remediated within that proposal and then tested following that. But this program does not allow for eventual sale of the product. The purpose of the program and the hope is that the MED will be able to gather some information about whether or not this is safe and what methods, if any, are safe for remediation if there is heavy metal contamination.
Go ahead, Lisa.
I was going to move on to the questions.
Yeah, so it looks like we do have a question from Amanda, and her question is: if you send product to one of your cultivations for remediation, aren't you likely to recontaminate the product? More often, the facility is the cause of the contamination. Is there a procedure for ensuring remediated product isn't recontaminated before making it to the consumer? So I have some thoughts. I don't know, Alyssa, if you have some thoughts on that one.
Well, you wouldn't. So there's a difference between remediation. So you wouldn't send product to a cultivation for remediation. You'd only send it for decontamination. So remediation would be an extraction process or something that would occur at an extraction facility, unless again, cold water extraction.
Yeah, and I think the concepts of remediation, decontamination definitely get flip-flopped. And, we've seen a lot, just to go back to the SOPs, we've seen SOPs misnaming things for remediation versus decontamination. But, assuming, if we're talking about pushing product for decontamination to another facility, I guess the short answer is, there could be a scenario where you're moving product that could potentially be contaminated by going to another facility. Again, this would come down to what the license holder's SOPs are with respect to the process for moving that product to a different licensed facility, the process for decontamination at that facility, how is it stored once it's gone through that process, how does it go back to the other facility, if it even goes back there at all, or if it gets shipped off directly to that respective licensees' retail stores. So a lot of companies do it a lot of different ways. So I think it's a good point that moving product around potentially can cause additional contamination, but it's somewhat of a rabbit hole if you really think about it, because you go through your process, you go through your decontamination, you get it tested. There's still subsequent. It's being put into saleable products, whether that's into pre-rolls or otherwise. And so there's, at some level, there's technically some further processing in ways that things can get further contaminated. Ultimately, you can't keep retesting before it's sold. So I think that's a lot of the problems in trying to figure out a system that works, because in every other system, it's, you have responsibilities to keep things that are not contaminated, and you're not having to test things on a regular basis. It's more reactive than sort of on an ongoing basis testing a product. If you look at, let's just say the alcohol industry, they're processing and making products that are getting pushed out to retail stores, but very rarely are they being tested or otherwise. And sort of, there's just unfortunately distrust within the industry from the regulator's perspective that they're putting out product that's unsafe for human consumption still.
Well, and also we do have, let's go back to the decontamination rules. So one of the big changes here was that, say you do send it to another facility and it's contaminated, you always have the opportunity with decontamination to then go through those processes again and retest. So that should help a little bit with that. With remediation, obviously, you don't have that option. It kind of is what it is once it's been remediated. Oh, another question.
Yeah, and I think Amanda was just pointing out that a lot of those other industries actually pasteurize products, and that is a valid point with respect to that as well.
Yeah, and also I just also wanted to point out to the product safety for remediation. Any product that is remediated after failed testing has increased testing requirements after remediation. So if a test batch fails contaminant testing, then you have to, after it's been remediated, it has to be tested for mycotoxin and water activity and those things, and that's not necessarily the same as product that hasn't. There has been some talks in the science and policy work groups as well, indicating there may at some point be a labeling requirement. That way the consumer knows that a product has been remediated.
So it looks like we have another question. I'm going to paraphrase this a little bit. So this is from Paul. Paul is asking about sort of expiration dates with respect to additives or material that he's saying theoretically can be utilized in 5 years' time. His view is that distillate almost has an infinite shelf life if stored properly, and the same could be said for additives. Any thoughts there, Alyssa?
I think that whatever you decide, as long as you have data behind it, that you should be okay. So if you have studies on either your product or other product, and you can very clearly show a data-driven approach to the MED in the records that you're required to keep on how you determine your expiration date, then I think that should be fine. And I think there are additives that certainly don't have an expiration date, but there are other additives that may potentially. And with the vaporizer devices, a key part of those concerns is not necessarily just what is in the cartridges, but it is the hardware in the cartridges themselves. So there have been leakage from the actual hardware that you're putting it in, and that's one of those concerns as well. So even if the distillate could be good for forever, that vaporizer might not be.
Yeah, and then what is that distillate being stored in, and obviously understanding what that looks like, and if you have data with respect to it being stored in that particular storage device, that it can be stored for that period of time, then obviously that would be how you can make a determination about your expiration date.
And obviously you won't have 5 years to come up with a study on your own product to know that it would be good for 5 years. But I think that you could include studies with related products and studies on your own products in the time period that you do have that could effectively show that you have tangible evidence to support whatever your conclusion was.
Yeah, and again, to harp back to the product liability piece, if you're wrong on the expiration date and your product harms somebody, and you've basically put out to the world that your expiration date is a very long period of time, you're likely potentially exposing yourself to further liability, and really thinking about, okay, maybe we think it could last for 5 years, but do we really need a 5-year shelf life? Maybe it's 1 or 2 years because we're trying to sort of make sure we're not getting too close to what our data is telling us is maybe being problematic.
All right. Any more questions?
Yeah. So I'll wait for a couple more questions, and I'll just kind of maybe try to surmise here a little bit. We clearly again have new rules for everybody to follow. From looking at the attendee list, seeing a lot of you are compliance folks. These are all things you need to get up to speed on. Make sure your SOPs are getting in line. We are continuing to see aggressive anti-marijuana folks, both on the products liability side, but on the private rights of RICO, trying to harm this industry. Sort of the last gasp effort in sort of the perceived potential federal legalization in the near term. And so, really watching your P's and Q's. We're probably one of the most regulated states when it comes to how our marijuana is processed and sold, and we'll be at the forefront of that, which is great. But at the same time, non-compliance with these express rules potentially exposes you to further liability. So, really just encourage everybody to think through these things. Hopefully this presentation was of some value. Please follow up with either myself or Alyssa if you have any further questions. We used to do these things in person at my office, and hopefully we can do those here really soon. We miss everybody and love to see everybody in person. And, I think we're getting there at some point here soon. And we'll continue to do these webinars throughout the year. You'll probably seeing some other folks from our team doing the next sort of series of webinars, but really appreciate everybody joining us, and encourage you to look out for our next webinar, and hope to see everybody soon. So I guess without any further ado, if there's no further questions, I'm just going to sort of summarize here kind of and sign us off. And I have some CLE things that, of course, I closed on my computer, and so I'm not seeing them. But, again, CLE credit, I think, is in one of the boxes below. Again, appreciate everybody's time and joining us today. And, wish you the best and good health, and see everybody soon. Thanks so much.
One more question.
Oh, we got one more question.
Thank you, Amanda.
Thanks, Amanda.
Yeah.
All right, everybody. We really appreciate it. We'll let you get back to your day. Thanks so much.